Hello everybody and welcome to World History. Today we're going to be talking about the exploration of the world by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Some people call this the Age of Discovery. I like the Age of Exploration because, of course, whether or not they actually discovered these parts of the world, well, they were exploring it for sure. Discovery is a word that means like it was brand new, but of course there were lots of people already living there. So I like the Age of Exploration, which is still true to what happened. Portugal is really going to lead the way. Portugal and Spain are going to be the main players in this story today. But Portugal is actually going to be the first one. Portugal, despite being small, ends up becoming really the first major European country to go and explore the world. Something that all the other European countries are going to be very interested in and want to do later. But Portugal is really the first one to do so, and a lot of it is because of this guy right here. This guy is Prince Henry the Navigator. He actually wanted to start a crusade in Africa, and he actually wanted to include Portugal in the slave trade, which we'll talk a little bit about later. He also wanted to begin trading with Asia. Remember that Spain and Portugal at this time are the most devoutly Catholic nations at this point in time, and he really wants to start a Catholic crusade. And he also wants to undercut some of the Muslim trading in the Indian Ocean as well. So because of all of this, he really gets the ball rolling. And this all starts in 1488. Remember, Columbus, of course, famously in 1492. But first we have Bartholomew Diaz, who actually came beforehand. He actually found the Cape of Good Hope, which is the very southern part of Africa. Vasco da Gama was another Portuguese explorer who came just a little bit later, and he actually found the route to India. Now, the interesting thing is that they didn't go very far from the coast. They actually hugged the coastline the entire time, sailing and stopping when they needed to. And that's how they ended up being able to get across over here and not overland. Because this is the first time we had good enough ships that were made in Europe that could actually complete this journey. Now Columbus, here comes the famous guy that everyone knows about. Of course, like you've probably heard a lot when you were a kid, Keane Fernan, Queen Isabella of Spain are the ones who actually approve his voyage. He's actually Italian. He's not Spanish, but he worked for the Spanish. He had the three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and he landed on the island of San Salvador, which is in the current day Bahamas, right over here, this really tiny island. That was in October 12th, 1492. He believed that he had found the Indies, or what is now Indonesia, over in the Indian Ocean, but he did not find that. He actually found a completely different chain of islands, but he didn't know that. So that's why he began to call the people he found Indians, because he believed that they were in the Indies. However, he was, of course, wrong, but he did know that at the time. Spain and Portugal actually fought over who would get what sections of the world, and to solve their dispute, they went to the one person who they both respected. That was the Pope. Pope Alexander here was the one who basically drew a line on a map and said, you know what, Spain gets this part, Portugal gets that part. It's called the line of demarcation, and that was in 1494, 2 years after Columbus. That's known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. And they also moved the line a bit further west, because the first line that he drew was kind of unfair. So they thought, okay, we should have a little bit more of this part. So all of this section here went to Portugal, and all of this went to Spain. That's why a lot of these countries still to this day speak Spanish, and Brazil is the only country in South America that speaks Portuguese. It's because this section was run by Portugal, and then all of these countries here in what will be known as Latin America later, were run by the Spanish. There were also a few other explorers that we'll talk about. One was named Amerigo Vespucci. He had a new idea that the land was a previously unknown continent. His ideas became influential enough to where a mapmaker later would name it after him, name the land America, after Amerigo Vespucci, a little known explorer, and half the world is named after him. How about that? Then we also had Vasco Núñez de Balboa. He was the first European to actually see the Pacific Ocean, going through what is now known as the Isthmus of Panama. And finally, another important explorer, Ferdinand Magellan. He was Portuguese by birth, but worked for Spain, which was pretty common, say similar with Christopher Columbus in that regard. He actually named the Pacific Ocean because he thought it was peaceful, or pacified, hence Pacific Ocean. And he also, his crew finished the first trip around the world. He didn't actually live to make it, though. He died in what is now known as the Philippines. And his story is very interesting, too, if you ever want to read more about it. Because he started with, I believe, 180 people. And by the time they get back to Spain, I think only 18 are left. So it's a very dangerous journey to go out into the New World at this time. There's no guarantee of success, and most people actually ended up dying due to all sorts of things like disease and not enough food. And just imagine being on a boat the size that they were for months at a time. It's easy to see how a lot of them definitely it was a tough life for sure. You can see some of their voyages here. This is Columbus, who reached what is now the West Indies, or the Caribbean, as it's called now, because he thought he was over here in the East Indies. This red line as well is also the Magellan's route through the world. He went all the way around here, died right around here, and his crew actually made it all the way back to Spain. So they were actually the first people to finish the first trip all the way around the world. Pretty impressive. So you can see all of the different voyages that were going on here, because this was really the prize over here. To get involved in the Indian Ocean trade, which we talked about in an earlier chapter, because there's so many expensive goods and spices that were going through this that the Spanish and the Portuguese really wanted to be a part of that as well. And this trade had gone on for hundreds of years at this point. So when they finally had the good enough technology to do so, they tried exploring and getting involved in this trade as well. Portuguese expansion. They ended up expanding to places like India, Indonesia, also known as the East Indies, places like what is now known as Sri Lanka down here, and Brazil. This leads us to progression of the Portuguese interests in what ended up happening with the slave trade. How did the slave trade actually begin? This will become very important when we get to U.S. history as well. So how did this slave trade really begin in earnest, the Atlantic slave trade, that is? Well, first, there was a simple desire to trade with the locals that they met, especially as they were going around the coast of Africa here. They wanted to establish good relations with the tribes, which at first worked out pretty well. But then the traders really started to see how much money they could make, and greed really set in. And this is where the slave trade really began in earnest, because the slave trade had already existed in many African kingdoms that they met as they were going around West and East Africa. And this is by the time 1600 rolls around, because it really gets started, in the 1500s, but by the time 1600 hits, the main reason to trade in Africa was for slaves. And why did they need all the slave labor? Well, a lot of it was because of, if I go back here, a lot of the colonies that they established here in the Caribbean and over here in Brazil were growing things like sugar, and sugar needed a lot of labor to actually produce it. So a lot of times they just grabbed slave labor to do it, and a lot of the crops that they ended up creating and a lot of the operations that they had needed a lot of labor, and they needed cheap labor. So they started importing slaves from Africa to do so. And that's really what causes this huge migration of people over from West Africa especially, but some in East Africa as well, over to what is now the Caribbean and over here in South America as well. There's a huge movement of people, and they're taken there against their own will. A note on slavery in the ancient world, as I'm talking about slavery now, because there's slavery as we kind of see it, of course, in America, especially with our relations with slavery existing all the way till 1865 and being the main cause of the Civil War in this country. We think of slavery a little bit differently than the people at this time would have. Slavery was actually very common throughout world history. places, like the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, in Africa too. Most societies around the world at this time in the 1500s practiced some form of slavery, and it's sad but very true that it's happened a lot throughout time, but the way that they felt about slaves was different than we might. Slaves in that time, you were still considered property, but you could still buy your way out of freedom. They had limited rights, and the children of slaves were considered free. So it wasn't a generational thing. It was usually people who were captured in battle, in wars, in things like that. You would be sold into slavery and work in somebody's house, and maybe over time you could actually earn your freedom. However, the Atlantic slave trade was totally different. First of all, what was different was that it was based on race. It became clear who were slaves and who were, considered free. And it was because all the slaves were imported from Africa and had that ancestry. Slaves had no rights, and they were seen as property. They were worked until they died. It was a very brutal form of slavery, and they had to cross the Middle Passage as well. That's the ship voyage from Africa to the New World, and it was very dangerous. So the fact that it was based on race, and it was a generational thing, that your children would be born into slavery and live their whole lives as slaves, that was all very new and very different, and it made this form of slavery especially bad. So why was the slave trade started? I talked about this a little bit before, but it was because there was a high demand for labor in Brazil and in Caribbean sugar plantations. The slave trade had already existed in Africa in a more kind of classical form, as we were talking about earlier, where your children didn't have to become slaves. But there was such a demand for slave labor that African kingdoms began to start wars to gain more slaves to trade to the Europeans. So it ended up becoming the basis of their whole economy, was the trading of slaves, where it had existed in some form, but it was nowhere near as bad as it became as it became. So what happened was, these kingdoms would start wars with each other just to gain more slaves to sell off, and it just completely devastated the whole region for hundreds of years to come. The effects of that. So we have triangular trade. We have triangular trade from Europe to Africa, from Africa to the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean to Europe. It looks something like this. From Europe to Africa went manufactured completed goods that were made in Europe, and they would sell it to the Africans. They would sell them slaves, which would go over to the Americas, and then via slave labor mostly would be raw materials like sugar and crops and all those sorts of things would go over to Europe, who would make that into products for Africa, and then it would go around and around in this triangle-like way. And that's what triangular trade is. And then finally, we're going to end with this, the Columbian Exchange. Things that went from the Old World, Europe, Asia, and Africa, to the New World, North and South America. So what things went from Europe and Asia and Africa to the New World? Well, things, unfortunately, like disease, smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, all these things that were Old World diseases were hit the New World. And we'll talk much more in depth about that when we talk about in world history. That'll be one of the first things we talk about. Also, some food and some crops that you might not even think about. Things like bananas and citrus. Actually, famously grown in places, here in the Americas, actually didn't come from there. Same thing here with what went from the New World over to the Old World. Things like sweet potatoes and peppers, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corns, all these things didn't actually exist in the Old World and came into places, of course, like famously like Ireland. They didn't have things like potatoes, for example, and things like corn. But the Americas didn't have things like grain, like wheat. We didn't have that either. We also didn't have livestock. So all the horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs that are in the Americas now are not native to this part of the world. They actually came from Europe, Asia, and Africa, believe it or not. So the first horses ever to come to North America happened after Columbus's voyage, which is amazing to think about. All right, everyone, that's all I have to say about the Columbian Exchange for now. We'll be talking more about this next year when it comes to U.S. history. And for now, that's all we're going to be talking about, the age of exploration. But it's going to have a huge effect on the entire world, especially with European nations becoming more wealthy, having more power across the world, and also being in competition with each other. It's going to lead to a lot of very dramatic changes in the world and world history. So I hope you can join me then. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.